talking about confidence in the commotion of life. And just one more thought there if we could, but I don't want to downplay this thought because it's really the critical point. Another passage of scripture from this, we probably can have memorized or have some memory of God is our refuge. He's our strength. He's a very present help in the time of trouble. That's a passage of scripture that many people are familiar with. But here's another one. The psalmist says in verse number 10 in Psalm 46, he says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth." Wow. In my mind, that 10th verse stands out in contrast to a lot of the other verses in this passage of scripture. When you read about the commotion in verses 2 and 3 and some of the other verses, it talks about war and arrows and swords and chariots and things of that nature. Just, I don't get the feeling, if you will, of the word "be still." And so it stands out in contrast. But the psalmist in verse number 10, that's what he does. He starts off that verse of scripture by saying this, "Be still." I'm sure I told that to my boys plenty of times. You guys be still. I'm sure I was told that many times too. How do you relax when the mountains are crashing into the sea around you? When there is violence and commotion? When there is noise? When there is trouble? When everything around us is shaking? Just how do you go about relaxing to allow your hands to drop to your side? That word "still" means relax, to just let go. It seems like that whenever things get like that, whenever the mountains are crashing and there's violence and there's turmoil and there's trouble and there's all kinds of shaking and rattling in our lives, it seems like that rather than relaxing our hands, we wring our hands. We walk back and forth, wringing our hands. How can I solve this? How can I fix this? How can we get rid of this problem? How can we address this issue? Don't you find that that's the way we react many times, is we wring our hands instead of relaxing our hands? In Exodus chapter 14, there's an interesting story there that really speaks to this. We find there in that chapter, Exodus 14, that the children of Israel were freshly delivered from the hand of bondage. And now they found themselves quickly in a difficult place. The Red Sea was in front of them. That was an obstacle. The armies of Egypt were behind them. That was their opponent. And as they were wont to do, they began to complain to God. And while they were complaining, God began explaining to Moses what they needed to do. And the explanation that God gave Moses was so simple, but boy, it's so complex. In my own words, the Lord told Moses, he said, "Raise the rod and stand still and see the salvation of the Lord." I'm not sure what that, in the natural mind, raising a rod and standing still and watching, what does that do about the army that's behind us? What does that do about the ocean or the sea that is in front of us? Well, the scripture tells us in that chapter that there was an east wind that began to blow all night long. The wind just began to blow. With that, through the whole night, they heard the noise of the wind. But when they got up out of their tents the next morning and they looked out at the Red Sea, right in front of them, there was a path through the obstacle. Now, we know that from that scripture that God had put a cloud between them and the armies of Egypt, and so they didn't even come near each other through the course of the night. Again, there's God. He's my shelter. He's my refuge. He's my strength. It's like he put a wall around his people. But on the other side, he opened up a door. He put a pathway in front of them that whenever they woke up the next morning, they began to walk across on dry ground, and then the armies of Egypt were drowned in the Red Sea. Wow. Be still. Stand still, God said to Moses. Stand still and see the salvation of God. Be still. Let God prove that He is the God of every circumstance in our life. But we feel like that walking around wringing our hands and fretting and fussing and worrying and just striving within ourselves and trying to figure it out, racking our brain on how in the world am I going to solve this problem. God says, be still and know that I am God. He said in that verse of Scripture, he goes on and says, and I like this, he said, I will be exalted. He said that twice. He said, I'm going to be exalted. I'll be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted. And he's very emphatic. He said, I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth. God says, I am going to be exalted. Folks, let's come to this understanding that God is going to be glorified. But what we need to do is let God be God. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know. I want to talk about the word know now. That's the word still, but what about know? There's different kinds of knowledge. Knowledge can be gleaned from a book. That kind of knowledge is fine, isn't it? Can be gleaned from a book. But there's also knowledge that is gained by experience. I go through an experience of life and I learn something. But I can know God by His book. But I need to add to that knowledge, by that book knowledge of God, with some experiential knowledge. Knowledge that comes through experience. Let it sink from my head down into my heart. Be still and know that I am God. And so today, with all the chaos and the commotion and the concern that's all around us, we need to fall back on the confidence of God that we have in God. And we need to be still, to relax, and let God prove Himself to be God. He said, I will be exalted. And so today, take this with you, that God is your refuge, God is your strength. Though everything around you may be shaking, it may be falling apart, maybe your body's falling apart, you feel like your mind is falling apart, you feel like your finances are falling apart. God's not falling apart. We need to put our confidence in Him, put our trust in Him, and let Him show us that He is God. Let Him open up that way right in front of you in your life. Let Him just show you the way that He wants you to go. God bless you. I hope you have a good day and trust in the Lord.